Alright, today this is the first tutorial we're going to go through in how to create the Final Frontier game in using GameMaker for Mac. So what I'd like to do is show you what you will need to be aiming for today. So if you see, we're going to have a scrolling background. We are also going to have objects that are moving. If you notice, the meteorite went on top of the star because they have different depths, so we'll be looking at depth. And this meteorite appears to be animated. It's created from a sprite strip. So we'll look at creating objects from a sprite strip. And the final thing we'll be looking at is different ways to have things wrap around the screen. This one is just using the plain wrap, so it appears in the opposite angle. The stars are actually going to a new random location, either above or below the screen. All right, the very first thing that we need to do is create our background. So we will create the new background using good naming conventions. We're going to call this BG space, and we will load the background image. So in our Final Frontier resources folder, there is a starry background. Once we've created that background, then we'll go into the room itself and we will create a new room. And in this room, first of all, I'm going to go into the settings and I'm going to just call this room, level 1. So room level 1. And I'm going to call this space the Final Frontier. And this is where you can change the room size, remember, in the settings. Then we'll go into the Backgrounds tab, and we want to select our space background. Now remember, if we want it to move, we can have it scroll, so horizontally or vertically. In the Final Frontier actual book settings, they have it scrolling horizontally -1, so that means it will go to the left, backwards. If you want to make it go on a diagonal, you can also have it scrolling vertically, so that's your choice. Just to test that out, when we hit the play the executable, we can see that our space background now appears to be going slightly to the left and slightly to the top of the screen, so on a diagonal, and that's just via the room settings. Now the next thing that we want to do is we're going to create some different sprites. The first sprite that we'll need is a star. So SPR for our naming convention, underscore. We don't want any gaps, no caps, and the very first part of it, remember, indicates what it is and then the name of it. Please do not leave things as sprite 1, background 1, etc., because you'll have a hard time identifying them later in the code. This particular sprite, it's just a static one. We're going to learn about sprite strips, and that comes from the star PNG. We will leave it having a transparent background. If you'll notice, it shows you green where it's going to be transparent. And we can also see right here that the width and height of this sprite, 32 by 32 pixels. That will come in handy later, knowing the size of your sprites. So once we've created the sprite, then the next thing we want to do is actually create an object. Now remember, objects can have different appearances, and we use the sprites to give different objects appearances. So the objects are what we program, the sprite is its look or its costume. So we create a new object, and so this is OBJ for object, and star. And we'll use the star sprite we've just created. Now, remember I said in the introductory part we're going to think about depth. So if we want things to appear in front of or behind one another, we have to think about depth. So this particular one, we're going to set at depth 100. That means it's going to be farther back. It's kind of an arbitrary number, but if you think of 0 as the very front, and then we just increase depth. So the stars are going to be one of the farthest away objects in our game. And then we're going to add an event. Now on create, so that means, remember, GameMaker has action events and action pairs. So when this is created, when it materializes on the screen, then what do we want this to do? Well, the first thing we want it to do is move fixed. So moving fixed means it can only go in these set directions. It has 8 directions it can go. This particular one is going to move down. This star we want to appear to be falling, and we're going to give it a speed of 1. So it will, when we place it on the screen, as soon as it's created, it'll start moving down at a speed of 1. What happens when it gets off the screen? Okay, so to our object star, we want to add another event, and that is going to be the step event. So first, remember, it's going to start moving in a direction when it's created and going down. Now the next thing, every step, we want it to test something. So as the computer, think about it as the computer's clock is ticking away every step, let's test. And what we're going to test is the Y position. Now remember, its Y is where it is up and down on the screen or on the vertical axis. So we are going to test its Y position, and we want to know, has it gotten larger than the height of the room? So this is where we use, remember, a variable, and we say test if variable Y, that's the star's object's Y position, is larger than the room height. And we use that because instead of hard coding and saying larger than 480 or a specific number, we can say at room height, and then if we change our room size, it will just continue to test for that height without us having to update anything. So that's a much more efficient way to code, is instead of hard coding numbers, we refer to variables. So what happens whenever you see in GameMaker one of these sort of stop sign or octagon shaped icons, that means it's a test. And if that test is true, what do we want it to do? Well, if that is true, we want the star to jump to position. So that's the icon for jump to position. We want it to be somewhere in a random position on the x-axis, so it isn't going specifically to the same place. Remember, randomization adds interest in games. So we'll say pick a random number on the x-axis, and that number can be between 0 by default and the room width. So any random number between 0 and the width of the room. The same as I said before, we don't want to hard code and put in a value there, because if we change our room width, then we'd have to find all the places where we hard coded the value. And with the Y, we want it to be above the height of the room. So basically we want it to be higher outside the room, so it appears to be falling. So what we'll do is if we say set that to a negative of the room height, negative of random the room height, what that does is it says take the value of the height of the room, any random number between 0 and that number, and then make it negative, and that way it'll be up above the room somewhere in negative space. And again, the randomness means that the stars won't fall at exactly the same time every time, so that they're above the room in a random area. And that adds more interest. So now the best thing to do is to test that out. So we'll go back into our room and put a star object in. And we'll run that and test to see if that works. Okay, the star's falling, so the first action is working. It's falling at a speed of -1 or going down. And when it is outside the room, it should have a wrap, and it should randomly appear falling after a certain amount of time. If that doesn't work, then we would have to check to make sure that we didn't have a problem. But it's appeared, and we'll let that go through one more time just to verify that it's working. So every time it's checking, now the Y has become greater than the value of the room height. So now it's put itself back up somewhere, if you can imagine, in sort of negative space, and it will begin falling at a random position on the width on the x-axis. So we've tested that, we know it works. The next step, we want another star object, and this one is going to do similar things, but it's going to go up. Okay, so now we're going to make another star object. Now we can start from scratch if we wanted to, or you can right-click and duplicate that object, and I'm going to call this one Object Star Up. And then we can just modify the events. So this one is going to start moving in a direction up, and I'll have to unclick the down because it can't go down and up at the same time. So it's going up at a speed of 1 instead. And the other thing that we want it to do is we want to change the step event in the Y because this one is going up. So we are going to have to change this. So if the Y value becomes smaller than 0, so that means it's going up, up, up. It's reached the top of the room. What happens? What happens when it reaches the top of the room? So remember, within the step event, or sort of every tick of the computer's clock, if you want to think of it that way, we want to test, this is a test action, if Y is smaller than 0, where do we want it to go? So again, we want it to jump to a given position, but we have to think about this. We want it to still be random, the room width, so that it jumps to a different random X position at all times, and that can be between 0 and the width of the room. But here we want it to go above the room. So we want to say random the room height, but we have to add on some amount. Now here, if we only picked a random variable between 0 and the room height, then it could appear right in the middle of the room. So what we need to do is add on another amount so that we can guarantee that it's always outside of the room, but at a random amount. So if we just